Thank you all for being here. I do a fair amount of speaking on college campuses, as I was mentioning at the reception last evening, when they let me speak on college campuses, that is. So I appreciate the change of venue. It's also nice to be back in Western New York. So thank you for the kind introduction and for the invitation to speak. I'm grateful that organizations like Advocates for Balance at Chautauqua exist, but at the same time, the fact that such organizations do exist tells us something about today's environment when it comes to having open discussions about important issues, and it's not something good. I spend, as I mentioned, a lot of time on college campuses trying to offer some balance. The idea is not to indoctrinate students or get them to take one side or another on a certain issue. Rather, the goal is to sharpen critical thinking skills among young people, expose students to alternative perspectives at a time when colleges and universities have become increasingly intolerant of intellectual and ideological diversity. A few years ago, some schools began sending out letters to incoming college freshmen that explain the school's commitment to academic freedom and how it does not support trigger warnings or safe spaces or cancel invited speakers because their topics might prove controversial. That used to go without saying on college campuses. Now it needs to be stated explicitly in writing to incoming students. This is the sad situation we find ourselves in today. College ought to be a place where students are exposed to different points of view, where their sensibilities are challenged, where they learn to grapple with alternative perspectives and formulate coherent responses to those perspectives, where you learn the difference between a slogan and an argument. On a lot of campuses, that's not happening, or at least it's not happening to the extent that it should be. On a lot of campuses, students are being taught what to think instead of how to think, and they're being encouraged to silence or cancel people they disagree with rather than debate them. What's unfortunate is that this intolerance towards different points of view seems to have spread off campus as well, which explains the need for these organizations like ABC, and it explains why they are so essential. So thank you again for taking the time to be here today. I thought I'd spend a few minutes talking about the economist Thomas Sewell. He's someone who had a huge influence on my journalism, and I wanted to talk about why so much of his scholarship continues to be relevant to our policy debates today. When I was researching my biography, I kept coming across Sewell's own descriptions of scholars that he admired, and I was often struck by how well those descriptions applied to Sewell himself. For example, after the Nobel Prize-winning economist George Stigler, who was one of Sewell's mentors at the University of Chicago, passed away, Sewell wrote this: "In a world of self-promoting academics, George Stigler epitomized a rare integrity as well as a rare intellect. He jumped on no bandwagon, beat no drum for causes, created no personal cult. He did the work of a scholar and a teacher, both superbly, and found that sufficient. If you wanted to learn, and above all, if you wanted to learn how to think, how to avoid vague words, fuzzy thoughts, maudlin sentiments that cloud over reality, then Stigler was your man." Or here's Sewell describing another one of his mentors, Milton Friedman, whom he also studied under at Chicago. Friedman, he said, was one of very few intellectuals with both genius and common sense. He could express himself at the highest analytical levels to his fellow economists in academic publications and still write popular books that could be readily understood by people who knew nothing about economics. I'm hard-pressed to come up with better ways than those to describe Thomas Sewell. When I think about a scholarship, whether the subject is economics or history or culture, race or political philosophy, that's what comes to mind. Intellectual integrity, analytical rigor, respect for evidence, skepticism toward the kind of fashionable thinking that comes and goes. And then there's the clarity, column after column, book after book, written in plain English for general public consumption. In 2020, at the age of 90, Sewell published book number 36. The title is Charter Schools and Their Enemies. I hope Sewell is not done writing books, but if he is, you could hardly find a more suitable swan song for a publishing career that has now spanned 6 decades. Sewell's first 2 books were directed at students of economics, but his third book, the semi-autobiographical Black Education, Myths and Tragedies, was published in 1972 and written for the general public. It grew out of a long article on college admission standards for black students that he wrote for the New York Times Magazine in 1970 after leaving his teaching post at Cornell. And it begins with a recounting of his own education, first at segregated schools in North Carolina, where he was born, and later at integrated schools in New York City, where he was raised. The topic of education, both at the K through 12 and college level, is one that Tom has returned to repeatedly in his books over the decades. In the preface to Charter Schools and Their Enemies, he describes a conversation that he had in the early 1970s with Irving Kristol, who at the time was the editor of a quarterly called The Public Interest. When Kristol asked Sewell what could be done to create high-quality charter schools, or high-quality schools, I should say, for blacks, Sewell replied that such schools already existed and had for generations. Kristol asked Sewell to write about these schools for his magazine, and a 1974 issue of The Public Interest featured a long essay by Sewell on the history of all-black Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C., which had not only outperformed its local white counterparts there in the district, but had repeatedly equaled or excelled national norms on standardized tests throughout the first half of the 20th century. Over an 85-year span, from 1870 to 1955, Sewell wrote, most of Dunbar's graduates went on to college, even though most Americans, white or black, did not. 2 years later, in the same publication, he wrote a second article on successful black elementary and high schools located throughout the country. In a sense, today's public charter schools, which often have predominantly low-income black and Hispanic student bodies, are successors to the high-achieving black schools that Sewell researched more than 40 years ago. And as he points out, what's clear is that these charter schools are not simply doing a better job than traditional public schools with the same demographic groups. In many cases, inner-city charter students are outperforming their peers in the wealthiest and whitest suburban school districts throughout the country. In New York City, for example, the Success Academy charter schools have effectively closed the academic achievement gap between black and white students. As Sewell explains, the educational success of these charter schools undermines theories of genetic determinism. It undermines claims of cultural bias in tests. It undermines assertions that black students must be seated next to white students in order to learn. It undermines the presumption that family income differences explain differences in educational outcomes. In recent years, charter skeptics have made headway. Limits have been placed on how many can open and where. Bill Clinton and Barack Obama both supported charter schools, but Democrats and progressives have moved sharply to the left on education more recently. And the rhetoric coming out of the Biden administration has been far more skeptical of charters, all of which makes Sewell's book as timely as anything he's ever written. In fact, so much of Sewell's scholarship, not just on education, remains relevant to our policy debates today. We're still talking about economic inequality, affirmative action, social justice, critical race theory, slavery reparations, and the efficacy of minimum wage laws, the pros and cons of immigration, and so forth. Sewell's writings have addressed all of these topics. Frankly, I find it depressing that so many people today know names like Ta-Nehisi Coates, Ibram Kendi, Nicole Hannah-Jones, and Cornel West, but not Thomas Sewell. His scholarship runs circles around these individuals, maybe around all of them put together, frankly. But it's not just the volume of his writings that surpasses those other individuals. It's also the range and the depth and the rigor of his analysis, which they don't come close to matching. He anticipated many of their arguments decades ago and refuted them decades ago, in some cases before the people making them today were even born. To the extent that Sewell is known, it's mostly for his writings on racial controversies. But most of his books are not on racial themes. And Sewell would have distinguished himself as a first-rate scholar even if he'd never written a single word about race and ethnicity. Another reason I wanted to write the book was to showcase his writings in these other areas. Sewell is an economist by training, specializing in the history of ideas and the history of economic thought. But he's also a sociologist, political philosopher, social theorist. One person described him as one of our great intellectual trespassers, someone unafraid to go wherever his talent takes him. Sewell says his favorite of his own books is A Conflict of Visions. And if you want to get inside of his head, it's certainly the one to read. It's a book about the history of ideas. He explains, or tries to explain, what drives our ideological disputes about freedom and equality and justice. And he traces these visions, or divergent views of human nature, back at least 2 centuries to thinkers like William Godwin, Immanuel Kant, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, down through John Rawls and the social justice theorists of today. The conflicting or contrasting visions he describes in the book are the constrained or tragic view of human nature and the unconstrained or utopian view. People with a more constrained view of the human condition see mankind as hopelessly flawed. They see inherent limits to human betterment. We might want to end war or poverty or racism, for example, but that's probably not going to happen. Therefore, our focus should be on putting in place institutions and processes that help society deal with problems they're probably never going to solve entirely. On the other side, you have this unconstrained or more utopian view of human nature, which basically rejects the idea that there are limits to what humans can achieve. This is the belief that nothing is unattainable, and moreover, no trade-offs are necessary. Everyone or everything is available to all who want it. According to this perspective, through the proper amount of reason and willpower, we can not only manage problems like inequality and racism, but solve them entirely. In A Conflict of Visions, Sewell argues that depending on which view you embrace, there are a whole host of public policies you're likely to support or oppose. He explains why 2 people, similarly well-informed, similarly well-meaning, will reach opposite conclusions, not just on a given issue, but on a whole range of issues: taxes, rent control, school choice, military spending, judicial activism, and so forth. When Immanuel Kant said that from this crooked timber of humanity, no truly straight thing was ever made, he was exhibiting this constrained view. But when Rousseau said that man is born free, but everywhere in chains, he was voicing the unconstrained view. When Oliver Wendell Holmes said his job as a justice was to make sure the game is played according to the rules, whether he liked them or not, it was the constrained view. But when Earl Warren said that his job as a justice was to do what he thinks is right, regardless of the law, it was the unconstrained view. This is the philosophical framework, the template, so to speak, that explains Sewell's writings on almost any topic, from economics and migration to education or race or culture. If you really want to understand where he's coming from, Conflict of Visions is where he really lays it out. Now, beginning in the 1970s, Sewell turned his attention to racial controversies. He did so, he says, out of a sense of duty, that there were things that needed to be said and too few people who were willing to say them. Tom's criticisms of the direction of the civil rights movement at the time is eventually what got him canceled, to use today's term. Black elites in particular wanted nothing to do with him because he opposed affirmative action. And they convinced others, particularly in the mainstream media, not to take Tom's views seriously, not to turn to him for a black point of view on the issues of the day. Sewell has long argued that the problems that blacks face today involve far more than what whites have done to them in the past. It's no mystery why black activists want to keep the focus strictly on white racism. Helps them raise money, helps them stay relevant. It's no mystery why politicians use the same tactics, helps them win votes. But Sewell argued that it's not at all clear that a laser focus on white racism is helping the black underclass. You can spend all day, every day, pointing out the moral failings of other people, other groups, institutions, society in general, he says. The question is whether doing so helps the people who most need help. Many of today's activists go about their business with the assumption that the only real problem facing the black underclass is white racism. A good example of this is the recent focus on policing in black communities. Do racist cops exist? Absolutely. Do some cops abuse their authority? Of course. But are poor black communities so violent because of racist cops or police brutality? And will reducing police resources improve the situation? According to the Chicago Sun-Times, there were 492 homicides in 2019. Do you know how many of them involved the police? 3. 3 out of 492. If police use of lethal force is a problem in Chicago, it is clearly a secondary problem to civilian use of lethal force against one another. During one weekend in Chicago a few years ago, 74 people were shot. One of the local hospital emergency rooms had to shut down, turn away ambulances because it didn't have room for any more bodies. Again, none of these shooting victims involved the police, not one. Young black men in Chicago or Baltimore or St. Louis may indeed leave the house every day worrying about getting shot, but not by a cop. Will reducing police resources really solve the problem? And is that what people who live in high-crime neighborhoods really want? Fewer police? Last year, there was a ballot measure put to voters in Minneapolis, where George Floyd was killed. Would have reduced police funding, defunded the police. Not only was the initiative defeated, it was most strongly opposed by black residents of high-crime areas who want more policing, not less. And the black residents of Minneapolis are not outliers here. They're typical. In a Gallup poll released in 2020, 81% of blacks nationwide said that they wanted the police presence in their communities to either remain the same or to increase. 81%. Another Gallup poll released a year earlier asked black and Hispanic residents of low-income neighborhoods in particular about policing. About 60% of both black and Hispanic respondents said they wanted police to spend more time in their communities. Efforts to defund the police are being pushed by activists and liberal elites who claim to be speaking on behalf of low-income minorities. But as the polling shows, they are mostly speaking for themselves. This is something Sewell pointed out a long time ago. In the course of doing research for the book, I went through scores of interviews that Sewell had done over the decades. He would often be asked how it felt to go against the grain of so many other blacks. he would inevitably correct the premise of the question. You don't mean I go against the grain of most blacks, he would say. You mean I go against the grain of most black intellectuals, most black elites. But black intellectuals don't represent most blacks any more than white intellectuals represent most whites, he would say. This continues to be the case today. Most blacks, for example, support voter ID laws and school choice, while most black elites, your academics, your NAACP, your Black Lives Matter activists, and so forth, oppose those things. Conversely, most blacks oppose racial preferences in college admissions, and as I just noted, oppose defunding the police, while black elites are in favor of those things. Sewell pointed out these disparities decades ago, and they've only grown since then. His writings on intellectual history have stressed time and again that intellectuals are a special interest group with their own self-serving agenda and priorities and ought to be understood as such. I often tell people that if you think Ta-Nehisi Coates and Nicole Hannah-Jones represent the views of most black people, you need to get to know more black people. Sewell has been right about this stuff for a very, very long time. So why does Tom Sewell still matter? Well, here's why. Sewell is now 92 years old. The book he published last year, as I mentioned, was book number 36, and his fifth since turning 80. That's not too bad for a black orphan from the Jim Crow South, who was born into extreme poverty during the Great Depression, who never finished high school, who didn't earn a college degree until he was 28 years old, and who didn't write his first book until he was 40. But even aside from that impressive personal journey, Sewell is a rare species. He's an honest intellectual. He's someone who has consistently sought out the truth, regardless of whether it made him popular. He has been willing to follow the facts and evidence wherever they lead, even when they lead to politically incorrect results. It's not something that ought to distinguish you as a scholar, but these days it does. Think about the current debate we're having over critical race theory, racial propaganda in schools. These ideas were once relegated to college seminars. Now they're entering our workplaces through diversity training, and they're entering our elementary schools through the New York Times 1619 Project, which attempts to put the institution of slavery at the center of America's founding, which is absurd. Slavery existed for thousands of years in societies all over the world long before the founding of the United States. More African slaves were sent to the Islamic world than were sent to the Americas. Slavery still exists today in parts of Africa, like Sudan and Nigeria. What makes America unique is not slavery, it's emancipation. It's how fast we went from slavery to Martin Luther King, to a black president. The economic and social progress of black Americans in only a few generations is something historians have described as unmatched in recorded history. That's what distinguishes America. These facts about slavery are well known to serious thinkers, to most historians. But where are these serious historians right now? A few have come forward. People like Sean Wilentz and Gordon Wood and James McPherson come to mind. But why so relatively few? Why isn't the head of every history department at every major university pushing back at this 1619 Project nonsense being peddled by the New York Times and Nicole Hannah-Jones, and now infiltrating our K-12 education system? The nation's top scholars ought to be falling over one another denouncing this stuff. Why have so many been so quiet? There have been countless books written by serious scholars about our nation's founding, and none of those books were written by Nicole Hannah-Jones. Why are serious historians so afraid to take on a journalist who has never written a book about anything, never published a single academic paper, let alone about the history of slavery and the nation's founding? The reason they are so afraid of her is because taking her on is politically incorrect. They will be called racist. They will be called sexist. It might damage their academic careers. They could be fired. They could be deplatformed. Social media mobs could come after them, and so forth. This is the sort of intellectual cowardice that makes Sewell's life and work unique. This is what distinguishes his scholarship: courage. Sewell wasn't afraid. Sewell was not afraid. It's the sort of thing that ought to be commonplace among scholars, and intellectuals, and journalists, for that matter. But clearly it is not. Sewell has spent a career putting truth above popularity, and I think we need 100 more just like him. Thank you. Nothing like what Tom had to go through. I mean, when he was coming along, there was another black academic named Walter Williams, and they were best friends. Williams was an economist. He passed away a couple years ago. But they were best friends for more than 50 years, and they used to share a joke that they should never fly together, because if the plane went down, it would be the end of black conservatism as we know it. That certainly would not be the case today. So no, I have not encountered the type of pushback they have.
Okay. Thank you for your talk. I was interested to hear the description of the survey results showing such strong support in the black community for mainstream opinions on organizations, conservative opinions. How do you reconcile that? And I don't say this to challenge your statistics, but how do you reconcile that with the continuing strong support for progressive politicians representing black and urban areas? And if you think that is a disconnect that can be solved, what's the path to solving it?
Sure. I get that question a lot, actually. In a nutshell, it's why do blacks continue to vote so overwhelmingly Democratic, despite the fact that many Democratic leaders express views at odds with these survey results. And I usually respond by noting that it's not a phenomenon unique to blacks. You know, people take all kinds of history and experience and priorities into that voting booth with them when they go to vote, and sometimes have complicated reasons for voting the way they vote. Some people are single-issue voters. All they need to know is your position on taxes or guns or abortion, and they're done. They can tell you whether or not they're going to vote for you. Other people are voting on a variety of issues. But again, this is not a phenomenon unique to blacks. So you know, there's an old joke about Jewish voting habits, that Jews earn like Episcopalians and vote like Puerto Ricans, which is essentially saying they're not voting their interests. They're not voting their financial interests. Why would you continue to vote for a party that's going to raise your taxes, be harder on small businesses, and so forth? Another example would be, more recently, would be Asian Americans. Out in California in 2020, there was a ballot initiative to be voted on affirmative action, on racial preferences in higher education and college admissions. And the liberals out there wanted to reinstall them. This is something California had stopped doing back in the mid-90s. So there was an effort to put back in place racial preferences in college admissions. The ballot initiative failed. It went down overwhelmingly, and Asian Americans led the fight against it. Yet those same Asian Americans on the same ballot, on the same election day, overwhelmingly voted for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. So again, the people compartmentalize their votes, their thinking on these types of things, and they have their reasons for how they vote. If Republicans want more black voters, my advice has always been, go ask for it. The big problem here is that Republican candidates, conservative candidates, do not, as a general rule, spend a lot of time courting black voters. They just don't do it. There are exceptions, but by and large, they write off this vote. They calculate that they do not need it to win, and in many cases, they're correct about that. And so they do not go into these communities. They are not in the barbershops. They are not at the churches. They are not advertising on black radio or black Twitter or black television stations. They don't do it. And what that means is that the Democratic candidate can paint his Republican opponent as a monster, and there's no pushback. If that Democratic candidate is in the black community and at a forum like this, and the constituent raises her hand and says, why are these schools so bad? Why are these buildings all boarded up and down the block? Why is that crack house still open? The guy can say, look at the Republicans. Don't blame me. I'm fighting for you. These guys are, they won't give us the funding we need, blah, blah. And there's no one there to push back. So again, if Republican candidates want more black support, the first thing they need to do is to go ask for it. And I don't think that happens nearly to the extent that it needs to.
Mr. Rowley, thank you for being here today. My question kind of starts off with politics and looking at the past. So if I give you an example, those on the left, a lot of times they pass laws like the New York State SAFE Act, and those laws affect people who are legal owners of guns. But when you look at the data, people who commit crimes, that's like less than 1% of those people are people who are legal gun owners. But then on the other side, you may have on the right people who are legislators who fight so hard against global warming type of initiatives, yet when you look across the country, you see the droughts and the forest fires and flames and things of that nature, and you're like, well, something's going on. Maybe we should start to do something, even though conservatives by and large may believe in global warming, but the legislators don't. So I'm like, why not look at the evidence, the facts? If I could just say one last thing. I got you. So, no, but my question is this, why don't they look at the data? I mean, why can't policy be driven by the data? Because when you pass a law and it's not working, then they should get rid of the law.
Well, it's a good question. I don't have a simple answer to you. I'm with you. I'm someone who likes to, like Sewell did, bring an empirical approach to these questions of policy. What's been tried, what's worked, what hasn't worked, and why. And so, whether the issue is gun control or affirmative action or some other issue, I'm with you. You need to follow the facts. Emotional appeals can resonate, though. That's what a lot of politicians play off of. Sort of a visceral reaction, hoping people don't pay attention to the facts. And that can go a long way, depending on how good they are at appealing to people's emotion. But I'm with you. It is a problem, and it is a challenge for anyone who likes to think empirically about these things.
I could just follow up on that. I think one of the problems with evidence is the evidence you're being given is not the actual evidence. And that might be the problem. There's a lot of bad stuff out there. I would say misinformation coming from both directions. So that's the problem. Anyway, my question, I go a little you're a Marxist, what happened? Could you go through that story? I think it's a wonderful story about how he made that transition from being a Marxist to being a free market kind of guy. Thank you.
Sure. Well, Sewell was, born in 1930 in the Jim Crow South, and for a black person of his age, coming up where he did, how he did, Marxism had its appeals, and he certainly wasn't alone. He tells a story about he left home. He dropped out of school and left home. He's about 17 years old. Had a kind of tumultuous home life, and just ended up leaving home early, and got a job as a messenger for Western Union, working in Lower Manhattan. But he lived up in Harlem, so every day after work he had to take a bus home or a subway, and on some days he would take. They still had these double-decker buses that would traverse the island, and he would get on down in the Wall Street area. And watch the neighborhoods change as the bus headed north. He'd go up Fifth Avenue and past the ritzy shopping districts, and then past Carnegie Hall and up Riverside Drive, which is Tony residential neighborhood. And then the bus would cross the viaducts, and there would be the tenements. And he'd get off, and he would look around and say, what just happened? Why does it look like this up here versus what I just saw, a half hour ago? And he said Marx explained that to him in a way that he found very, very compelling at the time. The people up here are being exploited by the people down there. It's the capitalist versus the proletariat and so forth. So Tom was a self-taught Marxist from his teenage years all through college. He went to night school at Howard University, the black college in D.C., did a year there, then transferred to Harvard. Then he went to Columbia for graduate school. He ended up at the University of Chicago studying under these free market giants, Stigler, Friedman. He took a class with Friedrich Hayek. Hayek was still teaching at the University of Chicago when Tom was there. Throughout all that period, Tom remained a Marxist. He was not persuaded at all by these guys. And they made no effort to change his mind about anything. But I'll tell you a quick story. While he was in graduate school, working on his PhD, he was having some financial difficulty. And he thought about just dropping out and getting a job in the private sector and giving up on the pursuit of his doctorate. And Friedman and Stigler, who were his mentors, heard about this. And on their own, without telling Tom, they went to a foundation that supports young scholars, no longer exists, was called the Earhart Foundation. And they said, we've got a guy who we don't want to drop out of school. He's a bright kid. Will you support him? And because they were George Stigler and Friedman, the guy who ran the Earhart Foundation said, sure, whatever, here, give him some money. And the head of the foundation said, when he went to his board as to why they should give Sewell this money, the line was, he's a Marxist, but he's too smart to stay that way. So give him the money. So they saw something in him even way back then. But Tom says what ultimately changed his mind about Marxism was a job in the government. He was working for the Labor Department. It was a summer job. He was economist in the Labor Department one summer, and his assignment had something to do with studying minimum wage laws in Puerto Rico. And Tom had determined or figured out that raising the minimum wage was putting people out of work. And he went back and explained this to his colleagues who had no interest in what he had discovered or the data he had to show it. And it occurred to him that Marxism and socialism and wealth redistribution and government intervention wasn't all it cracked up to be. Sometimes it was hurting people. For him, it was a lesson in trade-offs. If you were someone who was receiving minimum wage and the minimum wage went up, you would be better off, provided you kept your job and the same number of hours at that job. But some people would not keep their job. Some people would not keep the same number of hours. And some people would never be hired in the first place because they have now been priced out of the labor force. And Sewell, this to him was an introduction to trade-offs, and that began his journey away from Marxism. So it wasn't studying under Stigler or Friedman or the University of Chicago. It was real-life experience, and throughout his career, real-life experience has informed a lot of his opinions.
Hello, I'm a conservative, very tolerant of change and adaptation over time, responsible change and adaptation. But as we move along in our society these last several decades now, I'm very concerned because the trend seems to be in a very highly irresponsible direction that's putting at risk and threatening the whole standards of the United States. And my question to you is, as an experienced writer, observer, and journalist, where do you see this trend going? First of all, am I accurate on my assessment of that trend? And secondly, you said that we need to stand up and speak up as Republicans or as conservatives more publicly. What can we do? What can we say to fulfill that challenge before us?
Well, I think I'm a little more optimistic about long-term trends. I mean, I think the country isn't going through anything it hasn't gone through before in terms of ideological divisions. I mean, I'm a little younger, but I'm told the '60s weren't the time of calm and and something that brought the parties together politically. And we've had war protests before. We've had political divisions in the past. We tend to get through them. I think one thing that might help this time is the left's overreach. I think that a lot of Democrats, including in this White House, have confused opposition to Donald Trump with support for very progressive policies. And those are not the same thing. And they're learning the hard way that those are not the same thing. And so this overreach that you're seeing, I think, will force the pendulum, I think, to come swinging back somewhat. We'll see what happens in the midterm elections. So I guess I'm a little more optimistic. But your second point, though, about speaking up, I do think is very important, and I think we are seeing some of that. I mean, I've talked about the pendulum swinging so far and the rise of progressives. I think they're getting away with a lot of this stuff because while they may be a very small percentage of the population who believes things like that, math is racist or punctuality is white supremacy or things like that. Not a lot of people, I take it, agree with that. But no one is speaking up and saying, this is crazy, or not enough people are speaking up. I mean, we're tearing down statues of Thomas Jefferson and erecting statues of George Floyd. I mean, this is madness. And not enough people are stepping up and saying, this is madness. Someone who swam on the men's team 2 years ago is swimming on the women's team, and if you have any problem with that, you need to crawl back into your cave. I don't think people are going to continue to put up with that. But you will need a critical mass of people standing up and saying, no, this is not okay. I don't agree with this. And that's, I think, is happening. I mean, we've seen it with some school board elections. We've seen it with some gubernatorial races. We'll see if we see more of it going forward. But I do just think there's a small group of people with loud voices running the show. And I think the people in charge need to understand that they may be loud, but they're not representing most of the country. And there hasn't been enough pushback. Yeah.
I would say that this village room is being macrocosmically.
How would you, or if you like to imagine, Sewell respond to the observation that drag queen shows are the left's gender expression of black-facing women?
I think that is well outside of my lane. and souls, by the way. One of the things, I will say something about whether it's transgender and the teaching in the schools, whether it's racial propaganda or teaching about gay issues or identity. I always come back to reminding people that a majority of our 4th and 8th graders cannot read or do math at grade level. Can we focus on that first before we turn them into social justice warriors? Because you're just going to end up with a lot of illiterate social justice warriors. And I don't think we need any more of those. So.
George Soros and his Open Society has had a tremendous negative effect, I think, on Europe, in Ukraine, Hungary, and so forth. And now he's sponsored something like 60 prosecutors in some of the major cities. I was wondering if you could talk to the effect of Soros and how we might deal with that.
Well, I don't see people like George Soros as this puppeteer controlling. I mean, for the right, that's George Soros. For the left, that's the Koch brother. I mean, people have in their head that these super wealthy individuals sit at home manipulating on a keyboard or with screens in front of them, pushing buttons, and society moves in one way or another. If you're a wealthy philanthropist and you want to put your money behind things you believe in, whether you're on the left or the right, this is a free country. I don't have a problem with you doing that. I do think you can show empirically that what he is doing in the name of helping low-income minorities, A, is not helping low-income minorities, and B, is not what they want. So, I mean, I spent some time talking about crime control issues in the black community and how they feel about those issues. And to the extent that he is putting in place soft-on-crime prosecutors, he's exacerbating crime in these communities. And the problem is, when people talk about mass incarceration, we have too many people in prison, we just need to let more people out, and blah, blah. When these guys get out, they are not headed back to George Soros' neighborhood. They are headed back into the ghetto to continue raising hell. I mean, these guys, in New York City, in a typical year, and this is true of major cities nationwide, 85% of violent crime victims are black or Hispanic. To the extent you're going soft on crime, that's who pays the price. And so he can talk all he wants about social justice and helping the underclass, but I'll tell you, not a lot of upward mobility is happening in violent neighborhoods. People talk about poverty leading to crime. I think the truth is closer to the opposite of that. Businesses flee crime-ridden neighborhoods. Jobs follow. Property values fall. Not a lot of upward mobility is going to take place in these violent neighborhoods. One of the reasons that black outcomes on many levels, income, home ownership, entering skilled professions, we had higher rates of this, things were proceeding at a faster pace in the first half of the 20th century, despite all the racism, is because these communities were not as violent as they are today. And that's, I think, an underappreciated phenomenon, that law and order is essential to upward economic mobility in these communities. And so to the extent that you have philanthropists like Soros out there undermining law and order in these communities, he is not helping matters at all and doing a great deal of harm. Yeah.
Last question?
It's a great honor to have the last question, and thank you so much for coming. It's been a great discussion. My question for you as a journalist is, what role do you see the media having in creating the increasingly divisive environment that we have? It seems to me, and I look back, I'm younger than I look, older than I look.
Well, I think we've played a hugely negative role in getting us here, and I do think we have a responsibility. But you did a pretty good job of explaining the problem. A lot of Americans are talking past one another now because we have all these different news sources, and that was not the same way 30, 40 years ago when you had three, Tom Brokaw, Peter Jennings, and Dan Rather giving the country the news. I don't know that we want to go back to three guys giving the country the news, but the downside of this proliferation of news outlets is people only watching or listening or reading things that reinforce their prejudices, and not paying attention to what other people are reading and listening to, and so that leads to a lot of talking past one another. One of the phenomena that I think no one saw coming was the camera phones and the way that impacted, particularly our discussions of policing and law and order. And because we have everyone has a phone and can make a video and record something, the media has led people to believe that things that happen rarely happen all the time. A police interaction with a civilian goes sideways, then the video goes viral, and because that gets more attention than it used to, people are assuming it happens more often. Although we have data showing that that is not the case. In fact, when it comes to police use of lethal force, we've seen a tremendous decline in the past 50 years, though you'd never know that from watching the media. So that is something that I think the press could be a lot more responsible in doing, and also simply in putting things in context. When the media wants to put things in context, it can do so. I mean, I'll give you an example of something like illegal immigration. Let's say someone's in the country illegally, they commit some heinous act. You go watch it, learn about it on the news. I'm sure every broadcaster is going to preface this by saying, this is not typical of immigrants or even typical of illegal immigrants. Most are law-abiding, following the law, blah, blah, blah. They want to make sure you put this in context. But when something happens like a George Floyd, which is not representative of policing, which does not happen all the time, they feel no need to put this in any kind of context, leaving their things to the imagination of their viewers and listeners and so forth. So the media has played, I think, a critical role here and a negative role. And I do think we need to act more responsibly. And I don't think the press did itself any favors in its coverage of the Trump administration, where it really threw the rule book away and said, we're going to, explicitly, organizations like the New York Times and the Washington Post said, we are going to cover this person differently than we've covered other presidents. And once you decide to do that, it's not like a light switch you can just turn back on or turn off again once the administration is out of office. There's a trust factor there that has been lost. It wasn't great to begin with, but what was there, I think, has been diminished somewhat. And now you see a lot of scrambling taking place in major news organizations to go back to the way it was pre-Trump, and I think they're finding that's a hard thing to do in re-earning the trust of their viewers and listeners and readers.
Jason Riley, next week, Thomas Sewell.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.